What's up, Gromies? Welcome to AROYA Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your moderator, Kaisha. This is episode 102. Shout out to our live viewers on the Hangout on YouTube and on Instagram, to everyone tapping in on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you so much for your support. And if you like the pod, drop us a review. We appreciate your feedback. Jason is in the house. Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Fantastic. Good to see you, man. All right, let's get this party started. You ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Danny dropped this comment. Love it. He wrote, pH going down in runoff and EC ranges in bulk versus gen seem to be hot topics. Maybe need to do a video that over explains it all. So if anyone asks, refer them to that vid. We appreciate the suggestion, Danny. We love an overview around here. So let's get into it, Jason.
Yeah,
pH,
absolutely.
Yeah, go for it.
Actually, I'm going to bring up a slide here that kind of helps us talk a little bit about what can happen. Sorry, little feedback there. What can happen as far as why we see pH changes in our runoff here? And basically, what it has to do with is nutrient uptake. So we got cations and anions, and when we feed, we're at some level of balance in here, right? So if we're in something like Coco, we're feeding 5.860, we've got a little bit higher concentration of cations than anions in there. And what's going to happen is as this plant feeds on specific elements that are in the solution there, it can modify what that balance between cations and anions is, right? So we can see nitrogen, depending on your nutrient composition, what chemicals are in your nutrients, it can be negatively charged or positively charged. And so on the left side, these are all going to be specific nutrients that are negatively charged. So we can see in most cases, phosphorus, sulfur, chlorine, boron, molybdenum, all going to be negatively charged. And then cations over here, we got our potassiums, calciums, magnesiums, irons, manganese, and zinc. So what's happening is obviously as this plant is feeding specifically on certain aspects or certain compounds in there, then we start to see the pH in the solution change. So the pH in the substrate solution starts to change, and meaning that our runoff is going to be lower or higher. Regardless of which part of the cycle it is, this is something that we always want to do continuous checks on, is the pH of our runoff, because obviously there's a few things that can happen here. One, if we're just simply underfeeding, then that plant's going to be running out of a supply of a specific nutrient. Easy fix there is just up our EC. If we are already feeding an appropriate EC, then we have a couple options here as far as pushing a little bit more runoff, so that we're diluting the unbalanced solution and recharging it with the stock concentrate or the stock composition from the nutrient supplier that we're using. And why you might see a difference in which way this pH swings when we are in veg or in generative, simply because the different chemical demands of this plant. So this is kind of a great breakdown, and kind of just thinking about, all right, as it's pulling up specific ones, that's going to be modifying our pH.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Jason. I'm all hard at work on a blog post because we do get a lot of questions around this, just like putting these pieces together. So thank you for that. Amazing. All right. You ready to get into some live questions?
Let's do it.
Let's go. All right. We got Carpe Drippum on the hangout with us today. He dropped a couple questions in the chat. Let's start with the first one here. Have you had any experience with using enzymes like phosphatase? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And manganese? If so, how does it affect your crop steering strategy?
Yeah, a little bit of experience in there. Old school product, Hygrozyme, still see it quite a bit in places. I know Front Row's been pushing their Phosphyme quite a bit. Really what's happening with enzymes, it's help increasing the nutrient uptake in the plants, which is great, right? We want this plant eating as much nutrients as it can and digesting that into, it's photosynthesizing that into plant material, which obviously can be increased plant size, increased bud size, better terpene profiles, higher THCs. The more that it photosynthesizes, the more money we're making out of that facility. So absolutely, I do recommend using enzymes if it's an option.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you so much for that. You dropped another one here. Wanted to know, is temperature of your water or in pot temperature ever used as a tool in crop steering?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just talk about water temperature here. Obviously, usually we're shooting for, somewhere in that 67-degree range, plus or minus a few options or a few degrees. Really, what we're trying to do is obviously we want cooler water so that we can have higher amounts of dissolved oxygen. So in most solutions, gases dissolve better in them as our temperature decreases, but we also don't want to be so cold that we're going to be shocking the plants at all. Another thing to kind of keep in mind here is how much does the temperature of your fertigation water change as it gets from its source, whether that be your inline injection system or your batch tank. How much does that temperature increase from where you're taking it to at the dripper itself? And depending on how far that water has to travel through irrigation lines and or how long it's sitting in those lines, it can warm up fairly significantly. So obviously as temperature changes there, it sometimes can change the pH of it and also change the dissolved oxygen of it. So kind of keep in mind, how long does it take this water to get to the plants, and or should we take that temperature at the drippers themselves and then do an offset for the temperature of our tank if we can. Substrate temperature, it's it's one of those things where we don't necessarily have a lot of control over it. Sure, we can take some measurements, but substrate temperature is going to be based on mostly like 3 factors. We could say 4 factors. There might be a few other small factors in there, but first would be room temperature is going to have the largest effect on it. Next up would be irrigation temperature, so that water temp that we were just talking about. Amount of solar radiation that's hitting the pot or the substrate. So obviously, a lot of times we'll see black pots are absorbing more solar radiation, far red radiation, infrared radiation, and then a little bit of wind speed or how much airflow you have. It's going to cause differing amounts of evaporation from that substrate. So things like mash pots probably going to have a little bit more evaporation coming from it. Slab, rock wool slabs would be on the lowest side of that. So, yeah, sure, we can modify it there, but what we're going to have to do is change other factors that we may not want to adjust in order to control substrate temperature.
Awesome. All right. That was a great question. Thank you so much for that, y'all. All right. I am moving on to Instagram. We've gotten a couple live questions here. Someone wrote in, I'm having a low pH problem, week 5 of veg. I think the problem is too hard of dryback. Is this a possibility? And what are some corrections?
It is a possibility. Usually when we're in veg, we want to have a pretty decent dryback. That's why we're always trying to match the size of the plant to the size of the substrate, just because we want to exercise those roots, get them chasing the water, get fresh oxygen and nutrients in it on a regular basis. And so when we are in veg, yeah, sure, the more times that we can irrigate it, typically the faster that plant's growing, as long as we're not overwatering, right? So that's why a lot of times when we're in intermediate substrate sizes, so not in a clone, but we'll be in like a 4x4, like a Delta 6 grow down, 4x4x3s or 4x4x4s, or you can be in a 4x Coco cube. Obviously there's other ways to do that. You got like just regular planters. That's one of the reasons that intermediate size makes it easier to run through veg. As far as your pH adjustment, kind of that question that I already answered here a little bit earlier was, all right, are we simply getting an imbalance of nutrients in there based on not enough nutrients, not a great nutrient composition match for our specific plant's needs? And some of your solutions obviously would be either increase EC if you are feeding too low, and or start to push a little bit more runoff, help rebalance that by diluting it out.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Jason. Okay. I got this one in a couple weeks ago. We just hadn't gotten a chance to get to it. Mitchell dropped this question on YouTube. They wrote, I have two 1,000 square foot flower rooms side by side in the same building, and they are identical rooms. However, the issue I'm having is that the first flower room always performs better than the second one. I ran the same strains in both rooms, but I'm experiencing the same issue. Flower room one always comes out better. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, what I would do is if you have an AROYA system or a way to track that data, start to try and digest it at the whole harvest group level. So take a look at those, 3 month data from room one versus 3 months data from room two. Do you see any differences in room temperatures, in relative humidities, VPDs, light levels? Just try and diagnose it. I know I get that it says identical in here, but there's a chance that something's running different based on maybe when your HVAC sensors isn't quite calibrated perfectly in there. So I would definitely dig in and try to get an understanding of if we have a different output, then there's probably somewhere a different input that's resulting in the output, and hopefully that gives you some insight on to what you can dig into to improve it.
Yeah, exactly. There's something different in those rooms. So good luck out there. Helps to track that data. All right, y'all. Gonna keep it moving. Sorry, we have so many questions coming in. This one came in on the Hangout. Seth just dropped it. Welcome to the show, Seth. I'm a brand new AROYA Go user and have been using the sensors for about 2 weeks on fresh transplants in 6-inch Hugo blocks. My question is about general parameters and what kind of levels I should be targeting as a beginner with lots of unknowns. I aimed for a 40% initial dryback after transplant and have been sticking to about a 15 to 20% P3 dryback throughout early veg. Is this an advantageous strategy? My EC at field capacity is lower than my feed EC of 2.5. Any idea why that is?
Yeah, so we got two questions in here. First off, just general recommendations. Transplants into like 6-inch Hugo blocks. Hoping you're going into flower with those. You can do it right from veg, but it's a little bit bigger. Like I said, my favorite is to always go from, if I'm using rock wool, to use a 4x4 cube for veg, and then get that onto a slab for flower. I aimed for 40% initial dryback after transplant. I try to get to 40%, not necessarily a 40% dryback. So when we initially soak up, most rock wool will see it at about 60 to 70% field or water content for its field capacity. And so I usually will just obviously do just a couple of maintenance shots on a daily basis, very, very small shots, just to make sure that the plant is getting some amount of water into its roots and stuff. And then I won't do my first real irrigations till I hit that 40%. So 40% dryback, if we went from, say, 65 and we did a 40% dryback, you'd be down at that 25% volumetric water content. And that's probably lower than we really want to go. And we're at that point, we have the chance of jeopardizing our rock wool, seeing it become hydrophobic, probably just a little too far. So usually when I hit that 40% water content, and typically that'll happen, 3 to 5 days after you transplant, then when I hit that 40%, that's when I'll start my regular irrigations for those. Have been sticking to about 15 to 20% P3 dryback throughout early veg. Yeah, that's fantastic. Obviously, if you're in a 6-inch and you're in 15 to 20% drybacks, hope your plants are going to be growing really fast. That's probably a little bit higher than I would typically see. A lot of times we'll only see those 15 to 20% either late veg or early flower, even in a 6 by Hugo. So yeah, just keep an eye out with that plant size. Obviously, if you're hitting that big a dryback and you're not planning to increase your media size when you go into flower, it might be a challenge to generatively steer, simply because you're going to require more irrigations than a generative Q will be. EC at field capacity is lower than my feed EC of 2.5. Any ideas of why that is? It's probably because your plants are feeding on more nutrition than you're giving them. So anytime that we see, EC levels lower than the feed EC levels, that means the plant's nutritional uptake exceeds that of the amount of nutrition input, right? So that's something where we really want to take a look and say, how much higher of my feed can I go here? And hopefully correct any of those issues. Typically, we should see EC climbing throughout the cycle, well, at least throughout late veg, in order to be able to hit higher EC levels right when we go into vet or into flower. So I definitely investigate how much higher EC that you can go and start leveling that off so that you're not running into lower substrate ECs and feed ECs.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Seth, welcome to the world of AROYA Go. Good luck out there. Keep us posted and let us know if you have any other questions. All right. We got this question. I think it's a two-part question here. No, maybe it's one part. From Doug over on YouTube. He wrote, currently running 18 plants, 9 plants each on 2x4 tables. Each table has a Think Grow model H4 4x4 grow down per cubes on top of a unislab. Room is 10 feet by 11 feet, 70 pint dehumidifier, 4.2 gallon humidifier. What is the best irrigation strategies for vegetative steering and for generative? And they're looking for number of floods and length of time during flower. Got any advice for Doug?
Interesting enough. So did he say number of floods? So I'm
number
guessing,
of floods
cool.
and length of time.
So he's probably running flood and drain. Kind of fun. You can definitely do crop steering with flood and drain. One of the things here, though, is typically it's going to be most successful with smaller substrates. So by the largest substrate I would be running in flood and drain, it's like a 6x6 Yugo. Definitely seen it happen where people can do flood drains with 4x4s and be successful crop steering. And really what's going to happen is, in order to crop steer with flood and drain, or crop steer effectively, the way you want to, would be make sure you have some substrate sensors in there with real-time data, and we can start to see the amount of dryback between our floods, right? And so if we are running generatively, we're just going to try and stretch things out. So if we can get away with it, we'll do 1 flood a day. If not, then we'll just continuously flood once we get to a high amount of dryback. So it might be, say, every time we get to 25% within that irrigation window, then we might do a flood. As far as vegetative, I do about the same thing, just make sure that you're doing less of amount of dryback. So we might actually do a flood every 5 or 10% within the irrigation window that we want. And when I'm talking about, within that irrigation window, obviously, we don't want to do a flood within probably 1 to 2 hours before lights off. We're just trying to reduce how much humidity is in the room, that type of stuff.
Oh, right on. Good luck out there, Doug. Great question. All right. We got this question in on Instagram. This topic doesn't come up much, even though pest and pathogen management does. Good Hash Rosin wrote, how would you prevent the spread of hop latent viroid if you found a plant with it in your facility?
How do we prevent the spread? Yeah. So make sure that we try to get rid of that plant. We don't take any clones off of it. And then, one of the next steps that I would do would be also check on where did that plant come from, right? So did we clone it in-house? If we did, then we need to do some serious investigation on, does the mother plant have hop latent? Did it contract that from some of our tools that might have been contaminated during the cloning process, and then also identify other plants that were taken during that same time, same cutting process, same mom. Try and see what type of viral vectors have been the cause of it. And then obviously if it came purchased from a nursery, then have a discussion outside of there and see what they can do to help you get a healthier stock.
Yeah, great overview. That is definitely a reality, unfortunately, that cultivators may have to face. Thank you for your question, Good Hash Rosin. All right, we got this question from Jason on YouTube. They wrote, to my understanding, hotter temperatures, like around 82 degrees Fahrenheit, causes faster plant growth in veg. Theoretically, if we flower in warmer temps, would this also give us bigger buds?
Yeah, it can. So obviously, the rate of photosynthesis is um, correlated to temperature up to a certain temperature, and so typically, in like a LED room, we can get up to that 84, sometimes 85 degrees for room temp. And what's going on there. It's early in flower. I like to have those temperatures up, right? I'm trying to get as much plant growth as I possibly can, so we can build it out to get some good infrastructure as far as how much bud can this plant support. So yeah, for depending on the strain of the plant, I'll be in those higher temperatures at least for the daytime, or late in the flower cycle, maybe 1 to 3 weeks.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Justin, for your question. All right. Rocket Bud Farms wrote this on Instagram. They want to know, how big of a dryback are we aiming in between P1 and the first P2?
Yeah, and you know these details, I always, when I'm thinking about vegetative and generative, I always just like to think about my irrigation window, right? It From first irrigation to last irrigation, what's that timeline? I mean, that's going to be the biggest impact as far as our amount of dryback, how this plant feels as far as what our crop steering does. What type of cue is it getting? Um, for for vegetative, between P1 and P2, usually we'll go anywhere from like 1 to 3%. And typically I just use that as the same amount as our drybacks between P2 events, right? So for P1s, I might have an irrigation every 15 minutes, do like 4 of them. That's kind of my minimum. And then if I'm going P2s, then I'm doing one every hour. Then I'll probably just start it the hour after my P1s go on. Just keep it simple.
Keeping it simple. That's right. We also, just a couple episodes, did a little dryback math overview, if that may be helpful. I think it's on our Instagram even. Okay. Speaking of equations, we got this from Ray09 from Instagram. They want to know, how do you accurately find the volumetric water content? Is there an equation, or does that come from the size of pot that you're using?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to accurately find it. One of the first ways would be use an AROYA sensor. Whether you're using the Solus for spot checking what that volumetric water content is, or if you have the full AROYA system, you get to see what that is over the course of time using time series data. Another way to do it is by, if you can use weight, right? So if you know the dry weight of the substrate that you're in, then we can have water in it. Any additional amount of water weight in that substrate is going to be, your VWC if you divide it by the volume of the substrate, right? So if we have say we have a 1 gallon media and we measured a water weight in that substrate of 500 grams, that's going to be 500 milliliters. So I guess I went from gallons to milliliters here. That's going to make my math a little tricky. But so let's say, yeah, we had, half a gallon of water in there, we'd be at 50% water content.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We're getting quite a few questions about like the math, some of these math, which we love. That's great. This one came from the Fireco LLC on Instagram. They want to know, what's the best way to deal with variations of dryback. 1 gallon cocoa pots, I have around 6 to 10% variations in my overnight dryback, and runoff is occurring one shot earlier in some pots to others. Is this okay? Or is there anything I can do to bring, I think, the EC all up to speed? Thanks, guys. Your sensors are the best thing since sliced bread. We appreciate you. Thank you. Yeah. What do you think, Jason?
So it sounds like these variations are, across the planters, at one time, if you will. We're not, I don't think it sounds like he's seeing variations on a day-to-day basis. So rather than, in this case, I'm going to talk about uniformity, because that's kind of my snapshot of how much alike are these plants in the room right now? How alike are they behaving? And so, 6 to 10%, I personally wouldn't get too caught up on it. might be the time to start understanding, all right, the ones that are having larger drybacks, where are they actually at, in water content? If they have a little bit lower water content in general or higher water content in general, and also take a look at the plants. Obviously, if plant size can dictate some of that issues or concerns. And then uniformity wise, is everything the same strain? If this is across different strains, and then it might actually be good. We'd expect different strains to be drinking different amounts. And so that, that could definitely indicate, all right, for specific strain A in the room, I need to run a different irrigation strategy than for strain B that's seeing those different amounts of dryback.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, the questions are coming in fast and furious. I'm going to keep it moving. We got this one from Tungstainer. They want to know what your thoughts are on too high K levels, late flower, and antagonism. I think K is potassium. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I have learned something in 2.5 years.
Nice. And so antagonism, I'm actually really glad that he brought that up. I will share a slide from the same slideshow that I had earlier, but a little different aspect of it. So let me jump back into the show. And we'll share it. I don't know if everyone's going to be able to see it very easy here. So Noodler's chart, this is kind of how specific nutrients relate to other nutrients as far as uptake. And in this case, we're looking at antagonism and then encouragement as well. So, or synergism is what they're calling it on this slide. Basically, what's going on here is when we're looking at different types of nutrients, if we have too high levels in specific nutrients, it'll actually block some of the uptake. And that's what that antagonism is. And so he's asking, all right, if my levels of potassium are too high, potassium K, we've got it up here in the right, they call it potash. We can definitely see some, a lot of antagonism in there. So it's going to be, we have to follow our errors. It's going to be antagonizing the uptake of boron. And that actually looks like about it as far as which specific nutrients it's antagonizing. Is that bad? There's definitely worse nutrients that we could be in high levels of as far as how they affect other nutrients being uptaken. So it depends how much level of too high are we? Because obviously that amount of high is going to be not only affecting the chart, what we see here, but it also could affect some of that plant.
That's a cool resource, Jason. So Mulder's chart, people just can Google that.
Yes.
Oh, amazing. Okay. Love that question. Thank you so much for that. All right. We just got this question in on Instagram. I think it's a pretty great one. They want to know, how are you crop steering when pheno hunting? And any special tips given the drastic variation in plants?
Fun question. How do we crop steer when pheno hunting? So that's, if you have the right answer for it, that's awesome, because we don't necessarily know how to crop steer a specific plant and even a specific pheno until we've run it a couple times, right? Where I would start off with is, how are you crop steering the crosses that this plant came from, right? And if they're unfortunately, when we make crosses, a lot of times they're not the same as either the parents as far as some of the growth characteristics that they express. So it is a real challenge, right? So, there's two options here. One, you can either try and do it like the parents, if they were similar in the ways that you found successful crop steering, or you could just kind of go middle of the road and see what happens. The challenge here is, obviously, you may not get the best expression, plant expression from some of those phenos, because we haven't necessarily had the option to tailor crop steering to it. So that's kind of one of the reasons I like to go middle of the road if we can. And you're going to end up seeing, all right, this, certain phenos express well under those conditions. Certain other phenos may express better than them. We just don't know what inputs they need in order to do that.
Kind of just adding another question, just out of my own curiosity, can crop steering shorten the pheno hunting process, make it go a little bit faster?
Possibly, yeah. So if we are doing a pretty drastic ripening, maybe we do a little bit longer type of ripening. Sometimes we can, get that plant to finish quicker. So you might be able to cut, 3 days, maybe 5 days of growth time. But that being said, are we going to see the full potential of that pheno if we try to cut it early? And when I'm phenoing, I really want the best expression of each of these plants so that I can make sure that I'm getting the absolute best genetic variation from this cross.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you for the insights there. That was a great question. Thank you for that. Okay. Moving on to YouTube. This one came from Paul. They write, how much can controlling root zone EC and water content actually reduce flowering time?
It depends on the strain, definitely. When we have sufficient amount of nutrients, sufficient water, and we are doing, actively getting good drybacks, making sure that we're growing this plant as fast as possible, we can definitely get to the plant infrastructure faster. We can definitely get, if we're doing a good generative queue, we can start to get that plant to build bud sites as quickly as possible. So yes, it works. There's typically no downsides of it as long as it's done well. And, you just have to make those runs, do some tweaks with the crop steering and see if you can get to a good finished product that has the yield that you want. Has the amber trichomes that you're looking for, just the right amount of ripeness, and do some documentation on it. Right. All right. If we start, and one of my favorite ways to kind of know when a plant could come down was with a USB microscope. So just taking some pictures on the computer of the color of those trichomes as they started to get milky and then starting to become a little bit amber. And that was really nice for the next run. I was running some multi-genetic greenhouses. So I'd have typically 4 to 8 different strains in a pretty large greenhouse. And I would also dictate kind of my cut down schedule. Any of the plants that last time that I know, hey, this one's going to be perfectly ripe at, day 61. Well, hopefully a couple other strains in there, we landed at day 61, 62, 63. And we just didn't have the staff to get everything down at once. Also, you could plan it out so that you are cutting when each one's perfectly ripe. So that was a great way to document it. And with a system like AROYA, you can just throw it right in the harvest group. So it's easy to find later. Just go reference that stuff.
Yep, that's right. Track your crop registration and use AROYA. We're big fans of that. Perfect. Okay. Good luck, Paul. Thank you so much for your question. Ian dropped this question on YouTube. He writes, we had trouble with our 1-gallon Coco plants running off at different times. The problem was that the pressure compensating emitters needed to be replaced. We also changed brands of Coco, which helps. So, thank you so much, Ian, for your feedback. Yeah. Anything you want to add to that, Jason?
Yeah. Run into it hundreds of times where pressure compensating emitters, one, they just start to wear out after, a certain period of time. Two, if you've run any organics into the injection system through the lines, anything that's, a little bit chalkier or chunkier, those definitely are going to end up clogging them up and making sure that you've done a good job using filters, cleaning your filters out. That definitely can help making sure that or prolong the life of our pressure compensating emitters. And another thing sometimes is actually get clogged past that at the drip stake itself. Out there's getting to be a couple of drip stakes on the market that actually they clamp around the outside of the dripper tube. which I like because, a lot of times I'll see that salt build up right there in the end of that tube where the traditional stakes go inside and reduce, how much volume can come out of it. So great work figuring it out.
Thank you so much, Ian. All right. Well, on the subject of drip irrigation, we got this question on YouTube. What is a good rooting in strategy? What is a good rooting strategy in veg when using drip irrigation? Is there a certain technique to get the plants to root in faster?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of went over this a little bit earlier. So really kind of my strategies are is make sure that, well, first off, make sure we've done a good job saturating the blocks that we're going to transplant into, whether it's Coco or rock wool, making sure that across the board, those are as unified as possible is going to make this process way easier. When we do get that plant into its new media, we'll want to do, small irrigations each day just to make sure we're getting fresh nutrients, fresh oxygen in there, encourage those roots to follow that water content and make sure that, hey, this plant just doesn't dry out because it doesn't have enough root zone in the new media to pull up that initially saturated block, and then use some type of sensor system to make sure, specifically probably AROYA would be the best way to do it, to make sure that we're seeing an overall dryback throughout the day, right? So even though we are doing some maintenance shots throughout the day while we're rooting in, we do want to make sure that, for those first, typically, hopefully you can get rooted in 3 to 5 days. We want to see that water content less by the end of the day than what we started at, right? So we'll do some maintenance shots, but not enough to increase the water content. So typically, yeah. So if we're in something like rock wool where we'll be starting at say 60, 65%, 60 to 70% field capacity, then we'll do maintenance irrigations. And then here, I guess I got a whiteboard I could draw it. We got some new whiteboards here. We're going to give them a try.
Oh my gosh. It's our first episode with a whiteboard, y'all. Look out.
We've talked about it for years, so.
We have.
All right. Let's see what we can do here. So let's go. This is going to be field capacity. We're going to call it FC. So we're going to put it at, say, 60% just to make some math easy. And then we're going to do some days in here. We have to forgive my whiteboard art because it's been a while.
It's just going to get better with practice. I think the whiteboard's probably going to be on every episode now.
All right, so we're at field capacity. And Chris is laughing at me because I am actually trying to do a really accurate job here.
It's like surgical precision happening on that whiteboard. Suspense is killing me, Jason.
All right, so here we go. I don't know if I can. Oh, wow. Chris is going to do it. So this is going to be a good example of how we want to do rooting in for rock wool. Let's say my field capacity is at 60%. So this is where we transplanted right here. I don't know if I can draw an arrow from the backside. Oh, that's good. So this is where we transplanted. These are those maintenance shots that I was talking about. So we're doing those throughout the photo period on. But as I mentioned, we want to make sure that by the next day, our water content's still less, right? And this is going to get us onto the trajectory of not starting our regular irrigations till we're about 40%. And each of these irrigations, like I said, is going to one, sustain the plant while it has very limited root zone. So that, that initial, whether it be a clone plug or whether you're going for a 4x4 into the new substrate itself. So we're getting those maintenance shots, like I said, to sustain the plant, get fresh oxygen, fresh nutrients in, encourages the roots to follow that water as it gets pulled by gravity throughout the substrate. And then, next day we'll do it as well. Next day we'll do it as well. And typically I'll do that until I reach about 40% with rock wool. And that's when I can start my regular irrigations after that. So that's kind of my very generic rooting in strategy.
Amazing. Thank you for the demo on the whiteboard. And thank you, Front Row Ad, for hooking us up with a whiteboard. We love that. All right. Well, that's a new cast member, y'all. Get used to that whiteboard appearing. All right. Going to keep it moving. On the topic of volumetric water content, we got this question from Despicable Dabs. They want to know, is 59% volumetric water content decent for Coco, or should I change brands?
Yeah, so I'm guessing they're asking about water holding capacity, so field capacity for the smaller pith type of cocoa, 60%, 59% right there. That's kind of across the board, typically what I see. And so, if I'm in a 1 gallon, I definitely want to try and probably use something like that where it's at that 60%, simply because it's going to allow me to grow a little bit bigger plant and still have some capacity to do generative steering. For, certain size plants, for the size plants I like to grow, if I'm in a 2 gallon cocoa, I do like the little bit chunkier stuff, which will a lot of times see field capacity closer to about 45%. However, if you are growing monsters, then a 2 gallon at that 60% would give you a little bit more holding capacity. And so when we break down that math, all right, if I have a 1 gallon and I've got 60% field capacity, that means I can have 0.6 gallons of water in that substrate. And then obviously if I'm in a 2 gallon and I'm at say 45% field capacity, then I can have 0.9 gallons of water in that substrate.
Excellent. Thank you, Despicable Dabs, for that question. All right, we actually have a follow-up to your whiteboard activity there from Carpe Dripum. You talked through rooting in rock wool. They want to know, does the rooting in strategy change much in cocoa?
Very similar.
Yeah, there it is.
Might just have different water contents that you're shooting for. So depending on the type of cocoa, your field capacity is going to be a little bit different. So you might have to adjust what that looks like and the target that you're shooting for when you start your regular irrigations.
Love that question. Thank you, Carpe. All right. JC dropped this onto YouTube. They write, my plants are pushing water through the stems to my buds and causing mold. I'm assuming I'm irrigating too frequently, overwatering. Any tips on preventing this? Looks like they're working with an AROYA Go. They have VPD around 1 to 1.3, and they are working with Hugos.
Yeah, some tips to avoid molds. Obviously, getting your environment dialed in. If I'm later in flower, I probably going to want to be higher than a 1 VP. I definitely shoot for that 1.4. If mold's been an issue in the past with this strain, I'll even go a little bit higher than that, like 1.5. For strains that I'm not worried about mold, that 1.3 definitely is a great area to be. It's just not worth the cost of that loss and hassle to deal with it. So you'll definitely, there's a chance that pushing that environmental factors up a little higher can help you. Making sure you have good airflow in there is definitely going to help reduce that. One that kind of goes without saying is general facility cleanliness. How well are we sanitizing stuff and sterilizing things between each cycle, and what types of activities are we doing during the cycle to just reduce how much spore content we have in the room. Obviously, it's almost impossible to eradicate spores completely. So we're just trying to reduce the total number of them that are in there. So, that's always the preventative. How to combat it. We talked about that with environment a little bit. Another thing, I like using silica as an additive. What that does is it increases the thickness of the cell walls. It just helps encourage the plant to become a little bit more defensive towards any molds and mildews. So increasing, plant health, making sure that we do have super healthy plants is going to be one of the first ways, or second ways if staying clean was our first way. One of the great ways to make sure that we don't have or decreased pest pressure or mold and mildew pressure as well. So I think, those are kind of the strategies that I would start with.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that, Jason. JC, we appreciate your question. Thank you so much for that. We also have a great education guide on integrated pest management. Just actually reiterates a lot of the points Jason just pointed out. So be sure to check that out. All right, moving on. We got this question from Golden Child. What would you consider to be too much runoff for soilless mix in a 1 gallon? I feel like I'm having to push an excessive runoff to prevent my EC and pH from walking away on me. I have to push like 1,000 milliliters plus runoff to maintain my levels. Any advice for Golden Child?
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a lot. Obviously, by being able to control some of these factors, reducing runoff, we can have a little bit better usage of our nutrients, have a little bit less waste and stuff. I'm actually glad to hear that, it sounds like you're doing it for the right reason. And that is because you're monitoring your pH and your EC levels in there. There's a chance that you might be able to, get a modified nutrient ratio. Is one way to do it. It's, starting to look at, hey, maybe I need to modify my AB or my base and my flour, just depending on what type of nutrient you use. So yeah, kind of analyzing, hey, is an option to go vary myself a little bit from manufacturers' recommendations to help combat that change in pH. And then, as far as keeping your EC dropped, you may just have to drop your feed EC if you see that the runoff EC is always high. The one thing I do kind of always keep in mind though as well is, runoff EC, typically it can change. So, that if we're measuring early in runoff, usually it's going to be the highest EC that we'd see in that runoff. And as we start, to see the EC and the substrate normalize because of the feed EC being lower, some of that runoff is going to start to get a little bit lower and lower and lower in EC. So kind of keep in mind of, hey, when are we taking that EC measurement as we start pushing some of the saltier amounts of solution out of it during irrigation.
Awesome overview. Golden Child, good luck. Thank you so much for your question. All right, we got another question here on YouTube. Boxwood Farmer 120 asks, when running a multiple strain room, I go from 2 drippers to 1 for strains that drink less to keep my drybacks more dynamic. Should I leave 2 in till slow drinkers catch up or maintain this strategy?
It depends. If you're treating this different strains differently by strain, then it's probably okay, right? However, in the past, I have seen some people apply this to, within one strain where they see, certain plants aren't drinking quite enough. And so they'll have, go from 1 dripper to 2 drippers. I personally wouldn't do it. It sounds like an increase in complexity. I might start chasing my tail a little bit on that stuff. Just, make sure you're monitoring it and shoot for the best average. Make sure we're getting the big plants enough water. And a lot of times the smaller ones will catch up. Yeah. So that'd be my advice here.
Awesome. Very concise. Okay. Going to keep it moving. We got this question recently from Spencer. They wrote, so I keep running into a problem where like clockwork in every grow room around week 4 or 5, I see the stalks in the colas start to turn dark purple. The plants that get the dark stalks have reduced yield and sometimes even popcorn buds. I follow you guys' advice and monitor EC and drybacks with my Solus. Any advice? I'm in a 2-gallon Coco core pots.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a weird one. I guess for me, I would try to just start to analyze what data are you seeing from those plants that's different from another plant. There could be a few things going on here. Is it based on an area in the room? Maybe it's like right under an AC unit, so you're getting colder temperatures. That would kind of indicate why it would be turning purple and a little bit less yield possibly. There could be issues obviously with drippers. Are they getting a little bit less water, less nutrients, and so they're starting to suffer for that reason? It's hard for me to say without necessarily enough data to suggest, but what I would do is obviously get your crop registration information and start comparing when you start to see that, or actually even better, before you see that, hey, is there some commonality between these suffering plants as far as the ECs that I see or pHs that I see versus the plants that aren't suffering, right? So if you can get, at least 3 or 5 or even more samples from each of those plants, and definitely on a day-to-day basis, ideally, something like AROYA Go could help you take a look at that time series. Why? Because when we are just taking a single sample in time, there's a chance that it doesn't quite give us the visibility. We'd have to catch the issue in that sample.
Those are some great tips. Good luck out there, purple stocks. Sounds like it can mean all kinds of things. So looking at the data is going to be key. All right. We've gotten a couple questions in related to terpene production. So let me start with this first one. Louisiana Cannabis recently posted, have you seen higher limonene closer to light and heat? I've seen this in my data. Have you ever encountered that, Jason?
I can't say that I have ever tried to draw a correlation necessarily between specific terpenes and locations. Wish I could chime in with something here. I don't have much. I got nothing useful, at least.
No, all good. I love the question. Yeah, let me ask you this one. This one came from Instagram. Do you guys believe in drought stressing at the end for some trichomes? So it looks like folks are trying to steer towards particular trichome production. What do you think?
Yeah, and so this kind of comes to one of my favorite topics, and that is what is drought stress. When we're talking about drought stress, really we need to dive into matrix potential. And the thing that's nice with hydroponic medias like Coco and rock wool and that soilless stuff that we're looking at, usually we have a pretty good idea of what the matrix potential curves look like in respect to water content. That's why we can really use water content to define, all right, where would we expect to see permanent wilting point? Where would we expect to see temporary wilting point? And how close do we want to get there at that edge, right? So traditionally, some drought stressor would be just getting to temporary wilting point, and not going much farther than that. In general, cannabis production, we don't even really get to temporary wilting point unless we're doing some extremely hard generative drybacks. So yes, with ripening at the end, we are going to be getting closer to drought stress than we might throughout the cycle, and definitely really doing that to make sure that we're getting the best trichome production as possible.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that. That was a great question. Thank you. Hands down, you. Good luck. And looks like I'm going to be doing some blogging about osmotic potential. I'm into it. All right. We got this question a couple weeks ago. Hadn't talked about it yet. But someone wrote in an ideal environment, should CO2 in flower run all the way through harvest? On online forums, it's recommended cutting it after week 5, but no data to back that up. What do you recommend?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of people that do end up cutting it for ripening, or at least decreasing it at the very least. I don't necessarily think there's going to be any issue with supplementing it until the very end. That's what I like to do myself, just because I want to make sure that, hey, for any amount of growth that can be sustained, to have sufficient CO2, and it's not going to hurt to have that extra CO2 during that amount. And so, for a cost benefit, to me, it's kind of nice just to have that available to the plant. However, results show, or people's results seem to indicate that it may not be significant as far as the amount of extra growth that can happen towards the end. So it kind of comes down to a cost benefit analysis.
Doesn't it always? Thank you, Jason. Okay.
In production, it usually does. Yeah.
It usually does. Yeah. All right. We got this question in from Biker2193 recently. They wanted to know, for the last 2 weeks of flower, what's your targeted EC range that you want to be at? So what are some considerations?
Yeah. Last 2 weeks, when we say EC range, so really what's happening here, depending on if you're supplementing, if you're cutting out your nitrogen and you actually have, a product like Fade, for example, that you're putting in there, we might see ECs if we are supplementing that with a product like that, then we might be at ECs of 3 to sometimes they're pretty high when we get down to that dryback. Since we are doing generative, we might see, all right, at our feed we're in a root zone EC of 3 or 4. After dryback it might be up in that 8 range, 10 range. As we've pushed those drybacks pretty hard, I wouldn't get too worried about that. And then obviously, if you're not and you're just cutting nitrogen out and reducing your EC, so let's say feed EC of 2.0, then we'd see is definitely a little bit lower ECs. And I like to try and taper my EC if I'm doing that, right? So I won't just go to a lower feed level immediately in one day. I'll start to drop it over a few days.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. Okay, sorry, we got some more live questions in here. So this one just came in. I think it's actually a really good one for us to kind of wrap up. Jedi wrote, they would love to see or hear examples of how they prefer to log the daily checklist. So pH, EC, etc., all the critical information. Any related suggestions? An editable whiteboard on the wall, perhaps? I mean, I think we're big fans of AROYA, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, we can jump in. I'll see if I can share it here just to show you all my favorite way to do it and why. And obviously you've got the AROYA web interface and the AROYA app. So it's pretty easy to jump in on your phone and enter these if you can. So it's an option that we call manual readings. And one of the best parts about manual readings is the option to actually chart them as well. So not only is it easy to enter them that way, everybody that's access to your interface can see immediately after they're entered. It's super easy because they're managed by harvest group. So if you need to go back and look how a specific parameter behaved for a specific strain in a specific room at a different point in time, easy to look that up. And then you also get that visual of the dynamics over the period of time that you've entered them into. So I'm going to share my screen here and give you all an idea of how that works in AROYA. Obviously, if you don't have AROYA, then some other digital format's probably going to be the best. I like G Sheets myself, but I have AROYA, so that's how I do it. All right, so let me zoom out a little bit. And we've got this little plus button where we can do readings is what it's called. And these are going to be our manual readings where we can select, all right, which room are we going to be tracking this in and the rating type. So we've got tons of options. Runoff pH is one that I'm doing very commonly. And we can plot this right to a specific zone. Maybe we need to make a comment about it. All right, pH is perfect. Or if it was low or high, we can be like, just any type of representation with it. And we can also attribute it to a cultivar as well. So all of these auxiliary tags are making it easier to manage this data farther along. And I'll go over the list of manual readings that we have available in the AROYA system here as well. So let's take a look. Reading types. Yeah. Drybacks, you can either do those manually or you can actually use AROYA to log those automatically by selecting when you want to get that dryback. If we want to put in feed pHs, definitely one to keep track of. Leaf temps, great one to have in there occasionally. Node spacing, plant height. These are ones that are kind of the basis of building a crop steering program. Getting this information documented, so not only do you know how it behaved this time, but you can know when you need to adjust your times or how significantly you're steering in order to optimize the size and the output of the crop. We got spot water content. So if you're in there with a solus, great way to, just validate that the data in the system is accurate. You can do some spotlight intensities. We can look at, stomatal conductance. If you have something like an SC1, if you're logging data in your dry room, we can look at water activity. Definitely a great way to start improving any of the drying processes you have, is start seeing your humidities and temperatures in the room, and then log that water activity, especially as you're getting close to target dryness. And then you can really dial that in. Do we need to go a day less, a day more? Make the most of the product that you've created. CO2 levels. So yeah, some of these numbers obviously are types of numbers that we have from the system itself, with automatically logged data coming out of the sensors. And a lot of times it's just nice to validate that, if we have any questions about it, or we're taking that information anyways, just so we get a hands-on feel for it. And a lot of these are just ones that are from auxiliary sensors that that you just need to get into a system somewhere.
And there it is. All right. Awesome. Well, Jason, nice work. Thank you for holding it down and dropping hella knowledge today in the studio. Always good to see you. And to our producer, Chris, thank you so much for helping me and Jason put together another great session. And thank you to everyone for joining us for this week's AROYA Office Hours. To learn more about AROYA, book a demo at aroya.io, and our team will show you the ins and outs of the ultimate cannabis cultivation platform. If you have any crop steering or cultivation questions you want us to cover, drop them anytime in the AROYA app. Email us at sales@aroya.io. Send us a DM via Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We want to hear from you. If we didn't get to your question, don't worry, submit it again. And if you're a fan of the pod, please leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your feedback, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you in episode 103. Bye.